Good evening, I'm Chris Lovett. We begin tonight with dangerously cold weather and steps to protect the homeless. According to the Boston Globe, the city's largest shelter, the Pine Street Inn, is expanding capacity to get homeless people indoors. Response teams are working round the clock. The city's response was outlined yesterday by Mayor Walsh.
Public Health Commission is working on making sure that our shelters are ready for increased capacity. We have additional beds ready to go for any homeless folks. We're going to be out in the street encouraging all people on the street to come in over the next few nights. We do it every night, but in particular over the next few nights.
The mayor says people in Boston should also check on their neighbors, especially the elderly. If you're having any problem with the cold, especially a lack of heat, you can get help from the city by dialing or using the app for 311. If it's an emergency, call 911. Officials are also doing outreach in response to gang violence in East Boston. Investigators say gangs with ties to Central America have been recruiting teens at East Boston High School. In a meeting at the school last night, local officials said recruiting was more likely in playgrounds and streets. Some residents said teens were being threatened. Officials said residents can report suspicious activity without fear of being penalized for their immigration status. In decisions last night, the city approved 8 new development projects. The largest was a 44-story luxury tower in the West End on the site of an old garage near the TD Garden. Developers recently increased their contribution for affordable housing and reduced the number of parking spaces. Among the other projects approved were 2 in Allston, one with 130 units of housing on contaminated parcels on Brighton Avenue and 32 more on Cambridge Street. Also approved were 44 units in East Boston near the Blue Line station at Orion Heights. Former Boston Mayor Ray Flynn's recovering from an auto accident while driving to his home in South Boston. According to the Globe, Flynn drove his car into the front of a neighbor's house yesterday afternoon while returning from a fitness club. He says he lost consciousness. Flynn was taken to Boston Medical Center for testing. According to the Boston Herald, Flynn says he had a concussion. The city's holding an event tomorrow for young people who want a summer job. A summer job fair will take place 12 noon to 3 p.m. at the Tobin Community Center on Mission Hill at 1481 Tremont Street. It's also close to Roxbury Crossing on the Orange Line. There will be workshops for teens, and a chance to meet potential employers. For more details or to register online, you can go to the website youth.boston.gov. Still to come, how people make the news. We'll talk about a new study on changing the narrative through social media. But first, this message.
Maybe we're not stimulating him enough. Maybe it's a phase.
Avoiding eye contact is one early sign of autism. Learn the others today. The sooner it's diagnosed, the better.
In the age of newspapers, radio, and television, news was a particular event with a unique place and time. In the age of social media, stories are networked in more ways than one. Events are a crystallization of trends and patterns, and with a larger cast of reporters and commentators, official versions are more readily challenged. Our guest has been studying these changes with a focus on the case of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. She's an assistant professor of communication studies at Northeastern University. We'd like to welcome Dr. Sarah Jackson. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with Michael Brown and Ferguson. Why did these become catchwords? Because if you look at the events, I'm saying this kind of thing happens all the time. Well, what's so special?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's one of the things that we have been thinking about in our research. And you know, there were events like the Trayvon Martin case, like cases, far before that didn't give it as much attention in terms of issues of police brutality and sort of state responses to that. And so we were really curious, why was it the Michael Brown case? And I think it is exactly sort of what you alluded to in your opening comments about the ways in which social media is expanding and becoming a tool for citizen journalists more and more. So even within the period of the couple years that separated the Trayvon Martin case and the Michael Brown case, regular citizens and activists had really become very literate in how to use social media and how to tell stories in social media in a compelling way. And the technology itself had changed. So for example, just a few years earlier, you couldn't embed photos or videos on Twitter, but now you can. So before, people would have to follow a link to see a photo or a video, whereas after Michael Brown was killed, people were able to simply take cell phone videos with their cameras, post them right on Twitter, and you would open your Twitter and see those photos in the feed. And so we do think that it very much had to do with both the technology, the evolving of the technology, and the ways in which people had really learned to use those technologies over time.
When I think back to following this case in social media on my own, I think of two images. I think one from the mainstream, which was the man chucking the Molotov cocktail, but the other photo, which I think you mentioned, was the photo of Michael Brown's body.
Right. And I mean, that actually is a really compelling example of how the stories got told differently in the mainstream media and by sort of citizen journalists, and in the study that we recently released, what we call counterpublics, or sort of everyday people, African American citizens, how they were telling the story. And you did see this difference where the mainstream story was very much about the crisis that was the response to Michael Brown's killing. So a lot of the headlines were about riots, and they very much framed sort of the community, Michael Brown's community, as being the problem of the story. Whereas the story as it was being told and reported by citizen journalists and sort of everyday citizens on the ground that were part of that community was really framed around that image of Michael Brown's body laying in the street. And, you know, he laid there for 4.5 hours before officials came and took his body away. And so there was plenty of time for people to take images of that. And that image was, you know, a very stark, sort of undeniable and traumatizing image, I think, for a lot of people. And so in that image told the story of a victim and told the story of a victimized community, as opposed to the story that was being told in the mainstream.
Now, as you found out in some really exhaustive study here of all these tweets, is that this wasn't just an accidental fallout as far as which story got to be told the most often. Talk about the first people and the ones who were most effective at generating the discourse.
Yeah, this was something really fascinating that we found. What we found was that there were initiators of the Ferguson story, of the Michael Brown story, and that these people were the people sort of closest to the ground when Michael Brown was killed. So these weren't journalists, they weren't politicians, they weren't people with sort of any professional training or elite status, but they were often members of Michael Brown's community. So what we found was the very first tweet that became influential in the network, talking about what happened in Ferguson and talking about the killing of Michael Brown, was actually a neighbor of his who was close enough to what had happened that she was able to take a photo and tweet it within about 25 minutes of Michael Brown being shot. And she immediately tells the story in a way that frames Michael Brown as a victim. It says, you know, kid walking home, you know, was shot down in the street, and it's SMH, meaning shaking my head. So she's sort of expressing her disbelief that this thing that just happened in her community. And what we found was that tweet was sort of picked up and circulated by people in her network, and then people those people were connected to, and then people those people were connected to, at a far greater rate than any of the other first tweets that came, for example, from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which didn't get an initial tweet out until maybe about an hour after it happened. And so really then became a deliberate thing within the network where people chose which version of the story to retweet and to tell, and they chose to tell the story that really privileged the perceptions and the experiences of members of Michael Brown's community, which of course historically and traditionally is not the way that news gets told. You know, normally news gets told from an elite perspective, and so this was a very intentional effort to sort of throw a wrench into that and tell the story from the perspective of the citizens.
You know, I think with both sides here, I can see a tendency to emotionally stretch the truth. And I look at some of the people on the ground, and then I look at the media, and I'm saying, you know, drawn to the spectacle of heavily armed police and disorders. I mean, it's so sensational. I mean, I'm thinking like a conventional media person. That's almost irresistible in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's really actually got complicated on both sides, and I think we now know that in retrospect. The photo that we were talking about, the photo of Michael Brown's body in the street, was being circulated by, you know, every activists and sort of everyday citizens trying to tell the story and create the outrage to get people to really see police brutality as a problem. And Michael Brown's family actually came out and said, hey, like, we don't want people to see our son like that. We don't want people to remember him like that. Please stop circulating that photo. And that was actually when they sort of gave the press and gave activists and themselves tweeted the photo of Michael Brown's graduation photo in his cap and gown and said, this is how we want people to see our son, not that way. And so there was, an ethical conundrum just as much as the mainstream media sort of being attracted to the story of violence and all these other things that really sort of in many ways degrade the community or undermine the community's response.
One other thing that you also pick up on is the way official versions of stories, especially when they're circulated through social media, they can be sort of turned on their head.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that's really powerful about social media is that traditionally in sort of one-way news and one-way media, those people with access to media, elites, got to tell the story. And with social media, everyday citizens, if they can get enough attention, if they can tell the story differently, can really challenge that. And so, in another study, we looked at this hashtag MyNYPD. That was actually a hashtag that was started by the New York City Police Department as a PR effort. So they said, hey, please tweet us photos of yourself with members of the New York Police Department using the hashtag MyNYPD. And they expected, to get friendly photos, to get photos of tourists with, police on horseback and, pictures of people where the police were helping them cross the street or, whatever they expected. And what happened instead was sort of citizens and activists on Twitter said, oh, okay, we'll tweet with that hashtag. But instead, they tweeted for days and days and days and days, millions of tweets on that hashtag with images of police brutality and with reminders of some of the cases, historical cases and more contemporary cases of police brutality claims against the New York City Police Department. And so the New York City Police Department really lost the ability to control what story was being told. And I think that's one of the risks that a lot of sort of more traditional organizations still haven't figured out how to manage in social media spaces, is that it's two-way, it's not one way anymore, and people will talk back.
Well, one very local offshoot of the Michael Brown phenomenon is what happened at Boston Latin School. You've been following it a bit, I'm sure. What do you make of that?
I mean, I think it's great because I think in one way it shows that young people all over the country are sort of realizing that they have power to tell their own stories, right? And that they can sort of challenge the way stories are told. And they got the attention, and I think that one of the things that's powerful about that is that, no matter what sort of side of that debate you're on, right? We now know that these students are having these experiences at Boston Latin. We now know how it's affecting them, how it feels. And it seems to me that it's created a conversation, not just in online spaces, but in, Boston and within, among parents, among students about what sort of racial inclusion and exclusion looks like in sort of contemporary Boston schools. And even those that we really celebrate as sort of being the best of the best at doing those things. So, I mean, I think it shows that even sort of, your neighbor next door, the kid next door has the power to really tell these stories in a way that matters.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. Sarah Jackson from Northeastern University. We'll have more news in just a moment.
I make an old subject feel like a fresh thought, and unconventional methods common. I'm a teacher. I make more.
If you're looking for pathways to Black history this month in Boston, you can find starting points from the Museum of African American History and the Freedom Trail. To tell us about some of the history and upcoming events is our guest from the Freedom Trail Foundation, the creative manager, Sam Jones. Thank you very much for being with us, Sam.
Delighted to be here, Chris.
Sam, talk about, for people who are not that familiar, what's so big about Black history in Boston?
I think that Boston is a place that's extremely important for Black history in America. Not only was it a center for the abolitionist movement that led up to the American Civil War, the place where Frederick Douglass did a lot of speaking, along with partners like William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips. I think that also it has a big role in Blacks fighting for freedom, African Americans fighting in the Battle of Bunker Hill. There were over 100 African Americans who fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill that we have documented. And so it didn't just start around the time of the Civil War, it was from the very beginning. And a lot of those stories take place along the Freedom Trail, and we're delighted to have the chance to tell them.
Well, even before the War of Independence, we have the early settlers here with their meeting houses. We think of Puritans, but there was an African American meeting house.
There is. It's the kind of the centerpiece of the Black Heritage Trail, which sort of joins with the Freedom Trail at the 54th Monument that was sculpted by Augustus St. Gaudens right up by the Massachusetts State House.
And of course, one of the other lessons you learn here is that the main reason we had an African meeting house is that the African Americans here were not allowed, at least in a comfortable way, as equal participants in the other meeting houses.
That's very true. The Old South Meeting House, which we know of as the place where the Boston Tea Party started, was first and foremost a church. In fact, in those days, they called it the Old South Church. And Phyllis Wheatley, for instance, who is a favorite of ours to tell about, she was the first African American to publish a book of poetry and one of the first African American woman to publish a book of poetry. She was a member of the Old South Church congregation and had to watch from the balcony.
Now, of course, if you were a white person at the time, publishing a book of poetry wouldn't have been all that remarkable. Why was it so remarkable that she could do that? For many, many different reasons. To give you only one kind of what I think is a really dramatic example of that, there were quite a number of prominent Bostonians who gave an attestation at the beginning of that book of poems, including people who were both revolutionaries, John Hancock, and also loyalists like Mather Byles and Thomas Hutchinson. They attested that she, in fact, had written her own poetry. And when you just sit and think about that for a moment, the fact that someone had to have people vouch for her, that was what Phyllis Wheatley had to deal with. Of course, the other thing here is that what you learn here, the continuum, is that there are building blocks of this city, and there are people who build institutions. And I guess you go on these trails, these sites, that's what you learn here.
Absolutely. And I think that the great thing that you see on the Black Heritage Trail is you see that African Americans had to build their own institutions. And they did build their own institutions, and that's one of the things that you see when you see the Abiel Smith School, for instance. You see a school that was built so that African American children could have a school to go to.
And again, this is the recurring of the same theme with the meeting house, that you needed a black school because there wasn't a place for them in a white school.
It's true. Although, if, for instance, just to take things away from African American history, but still germane to the conversation, when you talk about Boston Latin School that's on the Freedom Trail, that was America's first public school. But you could only go if you were a white male. So there were a lot of restrictions back then, and I think it's been a big part of our American history to really make that all men are created equal, all Americans are created equal promise kind of come to fruition and break down some of those barriers.
Now, there's a sequel to this in the month of March, Women's History Month, so we have
Absolutely.
Something going on for that as well.
Yes, so we've actually been doing our African American Patriots Tour for a few years now. The Revolutionary Women's Tour, as we're calling it, brand new for this year. And again, it'll break off from the Freedom Trail a little bit at points, but really it's kind of hitting places on the Freedom Trail. One of the nice things about the places on the Freedom Trail, they had a role in the American Revolution. Frequently, people came back to them for other reasons, for abolitionist meetings, and it was also a place where women spoke. Like, for instance, Faneuil Hall is kind of what I'm thinking of here, is a place where people spoke out and women were allowed to speak there, and you have speakers like Harriet Tubman spoke there, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, things like that.
Of course, we have the statue of the three women on Commonwealth Avenue Mall.
Yeah.
Phyllis Wheatley and Lucy Stone, and Abigail Adams. I
think that's right. Yeah.
It tells me here that history is also a continuum, because there are people you look to these generations behind, and they inspire people.
That's true. And what the people in history mean to us now comes through our filter, and so it changes every single year. History is kind of a living and evolving thing. I saw a great lecture which really inspired me in helping to put together this tour for the Freedom Trail Foundation, that was done by Jill Lepore at the Old North Church, talking about Jane Franklin Mecum, who was Ben Franklin's favorite sister, who is buried in the Granary Burying Ground, and where Franklin's parents are. We'll visit that spot on the Revolutionary Women's Tour. And she talked about how women of that time period were taught to read so that they could read the Bible and be good Christians, but they weren't taught to write, because writing was for business and business was the province of men. And Jane was rare in that Ben taught her how to write so they could exchange this correspondence, lots of letters between the two of them. But that was something that was really staggering to me, because like you and I and everybody else watching this, we learned to write and to read together as one thing, and to separate them and take away the ability to write from women, well, that really painted a picture of what things were like back then for me.
Chris, the other thing about going to these tours is there are things that you walk by and you only know half the story. I'm thinking of the statue, the sculpture of the 54th Regiment across from the State House. I walked by that for years. I didn't know the story. And I think you need to hear a backstory, because you got the officer and the horse and you got the foot soldiers, and you don't realize how much black leadership made that possible.
Absolutely. And the doomed attack on Battery Wagner, I mean, it didn't accomplish too much in the Civil War, except that it showed that African American soldiers were as ready to fight and die and bleed as white soldiers were, and gave us our first Medal of Honor soldier from the African American ranks in William Carney, who was a member of that regiment, the flag bearer who never let the flag touch the ground, even though he was shot 4 or 5 times, I believe. So some amazing stories there. Right up there on that hill, one thing I think of with the Revolutionary Women's Tour, which you don't really think of when you think of the Massachusetts State House, in front of each wing is a statue of a woman. There's a statue of Anne Hutchinson, who was the center of the antinomian controversy when she held religious meetings in her home and was banished from Boston. One of her supporters when that happened was a woman named Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker. And Mary Dyer was expelled from Boston several times. She was banished from Boston. She kept coming back, trying to preach the Quaker faith, and the last time she came back, she was hanged on Boston Common. And so there's a statue for each of them in front of the State House, and I think that people don't tend to notice those statues. Well, on our tour, we'll take them there and we'll tell them those stories.
You should mention, if you package things a bit here, there's some incentives, maybe as far as the Freedom Trail and the museum?
Yes, for the African American Patriots Tour, if you attend the African American Patriots Tour, you receive half off on admission to the African Museum.
We should mention, if people want some more details, what's the best way to check that out?
Our website, which is very easy to find, it's thefreedomtrail.org. You got to remember to put the instead of just Freedom Trail, but a search for Freedom Trail will turn it up as the first thing, and all the info is there.
Thank you very much for being with us.
A delight, thank you.
From the Freedom Trail Foundation, Sam Jones.
Valentine's Day is just around the corner. Lovers who would normally be thinking about a romantic bistro or a mountain cabin are thinking the Museum of Fine Arts. This weekend, Watson Adventures is producing 3 Naked at the Museum scavenger hunts at the MFA. Participants will find themselves racing around the hallowed halls following racy clues as they catch all the highlights. My guest, Shannon Skilling, is here to give us all the bare facts about this adult-only event. Welcome to Neighborhood Network News.
Thank you.
All right. So this is adults only at the Museum of Fine Arts. Do you often get people who have never been to the Museum of Fine Arts coming for this kind of fun thing?
Oh, definitely. We have people all the time who come in and say, I can't believe I never get to the MFA. And this is a great way for them to, enjoy the museum right in their backyard. It's a beautiful way to anticipate and sort of see things that you may have just walked right by and not even looked at.
All right, so now let's step back and think, when people hear Watson, they think Sherlock Holmes, but this is actually a man named Watson developed this, and you're part of a national, I won't say chain or franchise, but explain what Watson Adventures nationally is.
Sure. Watson Adventures, we call them sort of satellite spaces or places
yes.
across the nation, so we can host events at cities and historic neighborhoods all over America. So we have Philly, D.C., Chicago, and New York City is where it all started.
Yeah.
And of course Boston. So we've been here a long time as well.
All right, so what is your job? You often lead these And I guess you have to adjust it to who's in the crowd there. But over this Valentine's Day weekend, people will meet you where, out front, or where for this?
Yep, I'm a tour facilitator, so people, when they buy their tickets, they'll meet me or another tour facilitator and in the museum, and we have teams. So you can certainly hunt with your favorite loved person, or you can come as a double dater. You can come with friends. We have many people who come with just gal pals.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just have to be your romantic other. So, and we'll get you all with your papers, and you're ready to go, give you directions, and you're off and going.
Oh, so this is a competition, and there's different teams? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so you can be as competitive as you
Yeah,
want.
oh,
But yeah, there is a
some
little...
people they don't show they're competitive until you get into one of these things.
Exactly, and people really use their teamwork, and you really discover more about a person.
Yeah.
And you can sort of play off each other's strengths. If someone's really good at navigating, maybe someone's really good at puns with our tricky questions, because you aren't finding, objects like a traditional scavenger hunt. You're answering tricky questions in the museum. So you're looking for things that are right there in the collection, things, as I mentioned, you may not have even looked at.
Now, I saw in the press materials that you guys try to get through a lot of the different collections. People may not realize there's, ancient art and contemporary American art and all that kind of stuff there.
That's right.
So you guys have cleverly spread the sites that people have to go to get the information for their scavenger hunt all through the, the very big museum.
That's right. It is sort of a whirlwind tour, we like to say, because we want to dabble you into all the collection in the museum, because there's ancient Greece and, as you mentioned, art of Americas and Africa, and there's so many exciting spaces, and it kind of starts to get people's gears going and saying, wow, I want to go back and check out that space, because they had no idea that that room was even there. There's even terrific period rooms that are decorated in the art of Americas.
Completely moved from over the... Now, I saw this weekend, we're talking about Valentine's Day and the sort of risque pictures that are there, but you also have murder mystery tours of the museum.
Yes, those are big sellouts. People love them. They sell out often. People love intrigue and murder, and part of the game, so to speak, is to solve the murder.
So is this with actors in it, or is it...
Sometimes we do have some actors that are scheduled, but mostly our hunts here in Boston are, you have your questions and they lead you to answers. As you get the answers, they lead you to information, I should say, where you start getting the idea of who the murderer is, and then you have to use your brains to sort of put it together and find out who it is and the motive. So you get points for both of those.
All right, now the two that we've talked about here are the over 21 ones, but you have family-oriented ones, and you have a sort of wizarding one. Is that right?
That's
It's
right,
Harry Potterish?
Yeah, we have quite a few hunts now that are really based on popular books or movies. The Harry Potter books, of course, there's artwork that can be reflective of the book, so we like to bring families in there who have maybe, as you said, never been to the MFA, and they see things that were reminiscent to the book and kind of bring the story to life for them, as well as the Star Wars series.
Yes.
We have Museum Strikes Back.
The Museum Strikes Back.
Yeah. So.
Now, we don't want to give the impression that your scavenger hunts are only indoors. There's if you have relatives or friends coming to Boston, you have to mention the Freedom Trail. But you've got a way to spice the Freedom Trail up, right?
We do, yeah. That's one of my favorite hunts, actually, is it's called Old Boston Hunt. So it's in and around the Freedom Trail. So you're looking for things that are off the beaten path, you might say. We have a lot of people who are Bostonians, and they've never seen the stuff that we show you. So they are very surprised. They're like, wow.
So this would be a great thing, even to bring somebody too special, because it can be kind of dreary just walking along the Freedom Trail.
Yeah, that's true. You don't know what to look at. Same
right.
thing in the museum. You just walk in and you think, where do I start?
Yeah, it's just overload.
Yeah.
Well, so where can people find out about this weekend's things? Going to your website?
Yep, watsonadventures.com, and we have all of our
locations. Then you pick the cities?
Yeah, you pick your city and go to the calendar, and then you can check the times.
And you can, in the calendar, you can see when all the Harry Potter and the murder mysteries and things there. All right.
All right.
I'm
Thank
exhausted.
You so much.
All right, thank you.
See you there.